So, Asha, can Trump get away with sending Texas National Guard troops into Illinois?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Asha Rengappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a scheme. I feel like we should change the title of our podcast to "It's Illegal."
It's alarming. It's alarming. It's alarming.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's like not technically illegal, but it's like really crazy. I mean, even if you could do some sort of mental gymnastics and it somehow be okay for all the red states to volunteer their national guards to come invade the blue states, that would be really problematic and not at all what the people who wrote our Constitution intended. Very problematic indeed. And I will say, as somebody who's on the ground in Illinois, there's a lot of really concerned people here on the ground. Like, this is, our lives, our neighborhoods, our city. And I think everyone's really concerned about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I have been making a little diagram that I'm going to post on my Substack. I'm going to try to make an explainer about it so people can check it out. It'll probably post this weekend because I have other content that's going up before that, but it will be in my roundup. But yes, I mean, this is also happening on the heels of a judge in California who ruled that Trump and Hegseth had violated the Posse Comitatus Act in the way that they were using federalized troops in Los Angeles. And it's interesting because that opinion goes through, it's worth reading because at the beginning it goes through the history of the Posse Comitatus Act and sort of, the many stages in our history, including at its founding, but then later on, of the deep resistance and mistrust and, not wanting military to be involved in civilian affairs precisely for the reasons that we're kind of seeing now, and creating Congress creating guardrails around it precisely to avoid the kind of consolidation of power and the potential for a president to be able to use essentially, federalized national guard troops as a national police force or as a secondary standing army that can be used against his own people.
Yeah, I mean, it's so core to what our nation was founded to prevent, right? I mean, you had a group of states that were really concerned about a national standing army because they saw what happened when the English government, what's now the UK government, was doing when they had control of an army that they were using against the states. So the idea that you'd have a president drawing forces and sending them into states to essentially to intimidate them, because I think it's fair to say that there's no request by Illinois for this. Illinois does not want these troops. Illinois has not declared an emergency, doesn't recognize there to be an emergency. I think by any normal definition of the term emergency, there's no emergency in Illinois. In fact, there's lower crime rates than there have been in other years. This is the use of troops from another state because Trump can't federalize the Illinois troops or without the governor's assent or participation in that, essentially in many ways to bully people in Illinois and to make a statement about his power.
Well, let's get back to the federalizing without the governor's consent, because that is what he did in California. But there are context-specific things that were happening in California that aren't happening in Chicago, and maybe he's hoping for them to happen, but we'll get back to that. But I just want to emphasize for our listeners a point that you made about the framers of the Constitution and what they were distrustful of, because it has, there are so many provisions of the Constitution that reflect that, right? You have the war powers that are divided between the president and Congress, where the president is the commander in chief of the armed forces, but the Congress can make rules for the military. They provide appropriations. The standing army clause, to your point about the standing army, which limits appropriations for the Army specifically to 2 years. It doesn't do that for the Navy, right? Because they always wanted there to be a, endpoint that could be, enforced. You have the Third Amendment, which nobody studies in law school. I don't know if people listening would know what the Third Amendment is. The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of troops. No one studies it because no one ever does this, okay? I actually am a little worried that we might suddenly need some body of Third Amendment scholarship. So you have, and then the militia clause, of course, which is relevant here, and we'll talk about it a little bit, which is that Article 1 gives Congress the power to provide for the calling forth of the militia when needed in federal service. The militia being today's National Guard. And it is, once again, that buffer, the understanding that maybe the president might need to command these troops for some reason, but we want to really create specific criteria, guardrails, procedures through which that has to happen.
Right. And just to think back to how things were at the founding of this country, the way that the framers of the Constitution intended it is that the House of Representatives was going to be the closest to the people.
Yeah.
That was going to be the direct election piece of the Constitution. The president was going to be selected by these electors, or going to be a bunch of fancy people. Senators would be indirectly selected as well, but the House in particular would be directly elected every couple of years, and that would ensure that this would be a way of ensuring that the militia wasn't going to be used against the people.
Correct.
And that was really the purpose here. And so there's an irony where you've got essentially here in this state. I think if you had a ballot initiative on this, I bet 80-90% of people would not want federal troops or troops from another state like Texas to come into Chicago to do whatever it is they're going to do. Have a parade or show force or whatever. But Trump, Trump's doing that anyway. And I think that that's very much the sort of thing that our founders were concerned about.
Yes. So why don't we talk about what's going on right now in whatever, Texas, Illinois. I don't know exactly where the troops are. So every state has its National Guard. And those the troops in the National Guard are normally and typically under state active duty, meaning they are under the command of the governor of that state. They engage in functions that are related to that state, typically things like disaster relief or, during the pandemic, National Guards were called out to do things within their state, sometimes to help control civil unrest or provide support for civilian law enforcement. But all of that is taking place under the direct command and control of the state governor. But Congress has passed 2 different statutes that allow National Guard troops to basically be used for federal purposes or federal missions. One is what happened in LA, and this is called federalizing the National Guard. This occurs under Title 10 of the U.S. Code. And what happens when they're federalized is that the National Guard essentially becomes equivalent to our U.S. armed forces in terms of, the president's control of them. So they are no different than the Army or Navy or whatever it is. And he can directly direct them. But there's an in-between status between the state active duty and this Title 10 federalization. And that happens under Title 32, under a section where a governor can allow their National Guard to be used for a federal mission when requested by the president or the Secretary of Defense. But importantly, and this is where it's different than what was happening in LA, they're still under the governor's control nominally. And it seems like that is what is happening right now, that Governor Abbott is sort of, basically accepting this request from the president and Secretary of Defense to use the Texas National Guard, but Trump is not directly in command of them. They're not federalized.
Right. So this would be in this Title 32 scenario. You essentially would have, I believe there, the president can request governors to provide National Guard, not require them. And of course, here you have, let's say, red states like Texas saying, sure, we can have the Texas National Guard or the Mississippi National Guard or whatever. In this case, the reason we keep talking about Texas, just so everyone knows the facts, is Governor Pritzker, the governor of my home state of Illinois, has indicated that they believe, or they have a reason, they've received information that there are Texas National Guard troops that are preparing to deploy to Illinois. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what he has publicly stated.
He says he has
Sources. I will note, during the pandemic, Pritzker had all sorts of sources that he would quote about different ways in which essentially we were being prevented from getting certain sorts of aid. He had to do all sorts of shenanigans to ensure that we got whatever, medical supplies and equipment. But in any event, the bottom line is just in this scenario, which, you have a governor of a state saying is the case, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But the point being is we could literally end up in a world where you've got a bunch of red states volunteering to use their National Guard to be sent into blue states at the request of Trump to, I don't know, have a show of force and intimidation on behalf of a authoritarian executive.
Well, to be clear, you could have it meaning that could be what they are trying to do, but it's not clear that is authorized in any way.
So, that's true. I agree. That fair enough. Yes.
Well, and I think it's fair because people could be confused because Trump did get several red states to send their National Guard to DC. And that's very different because DC is the DC, National Guard. DC is not a state. He has direct control of the National Guard there, and basically, it's sketchy. I don't think it's ever been done before, but it doesn't raise the same federalism concerns that for states to send their National Guard troops at the request of the president to DC, which I think is also bad and needs some clarification. But that's very different than sending it into another state, which is a separate sovereign. And that's the important thing. States under our Constitution are separate sovereigns. And under Article 4 of the Constitution, they are guaranteed their sovereignty, basically, to have control over their state. And so for this to happen in the way that we think it is looking like, that the National Guard is still under Texas's control, and if they were to go into Illinois, that would basically be an invasion.
Right. An invasion by a different state's militia, commandeered by the President of the United States. Now, I just want to have a shout out because the last time we talked about this, we had as our guest Steve Laddick.
Oh, yeah, he's great.
It was super great.
Yeah.
Frequent guests. I mean, we don't have many guests on our podcast, but when we do, it's often Steve Laddick because he's really smart on these issues. And he has his own Substack, and you can go to steveladdick.com if you want to read it. His last name is VLADECK.com. But, he had kind of presented, I would say, a novel argument about, I think it's correct. The reason it's novel is because it's never happened before. It's sort of like the Third Amendment scholarship that you're referring to, the quartering of troops. But essentially, Article 4 of the Constitution guarantees that the United States is guaranteeing to every state that they will be protected against invasion, that they'll be protected against violence and so forth. So really, it would seem that this invasion from another state might violate Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution.
Right. And one of the other things that Steve says is that also under the Constitution, the Supreme Court has original and exclusive jurisdiction to hear cases between states. In other words, if one state is suing another state, then they can file it directly in the Supreme Court. It doesn't have to be filed in district court and go up on appeal. Now, I learned from him yesterday that this is surprising to me, that the court doesn't have to take it. I feel like some of this stuff has to change. Like, the grand poobahs that, in black robes that get to pick and choose. But technically speaking, they could file it directly and have the Supreme Court basically be the fact-finding body as opposed to a court of appeal on what is happening. And they only need 5 votes to take that case. And it sounds like he thinks that would be the right way to go.
Well, it would certainly be much faster. And I think this brings us to a bigger question, because you hearken back to that California decision. That decision was by a district judge, a trial judge in San Francisco, I believe. Actually, I believe he's the younger brother of former Justice Breyer, if I recall correctly.
Is he? I didn't know that.
Sure. I know they're related for sure.
Okay.
But Judge Breyer in San Francisco issued his ruling. But one thing that I think that a lot of people listening to our podcast or watching it, if you're watching it on the Midas Touch Network, people who are wondering, why is it that judges find things and order things and declare things, and it doesn't seem to stop Trump? And I think part of the reason that Professor Vladeck is suggesting go right to the Supreme Court is the thought that, you could go to one of my former colleagues who's on the bench in Chicago, and you could file a complaint there and have that judge be the finder of fact, and would go to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and would go to the Supreme Court eventually. But some random judge in Chicago is not going to command Trump's attention and respect in the same way that the Supreme Court would. And it's interesting because eventually you may get to a spot where Trump defies them as well. I don't know what we do at that point. But I think at least now he likes the fact that the Supreme Court rules his way in certain respects. And it's a bigger step for him to challenge the Supreme Court. So he's less likely to do it. I think that's sort of where Steve's going with that.
I mean, how far have we fallen, though, if that's I don't disagree with him, but just that what if the Overton window has shifted, that we're like, well, he might defy the lower courts, but he's less likely to do it if it goes directly to the Supreme Court. I mean, it's just kind of, to me, another way in which we have sunk so low, and there are certain things, I won't say they've become normalized, because I think you and I try to denormalize these things, but in some ways they're sort of accepted as the way that Trump operates under a constitutional order, which is just, it's awful when you think about it. Like, we can't follow the normal course of filing court cases, and let it percolate up, because there is a good chance that Trump won't listen and will just keep doing what he's doing anyway.
Well, you could just take a step back here for a minute. We're discussing Trump sending troops into Illinois to invade our state. Now, I will say, this is top news in Illinois. Okay, everyone's talking about it here. But I'm suspect you live in Connecticut. I doubt that people in Connecticut are really putting the rest of their lives on hold to contemplate the fact that Trump is sending troops into my state. Ultimately, people are having their pizza, going for plays, hanging out, enjoying the weather outside and baseball games and so forth. and they're living their lives. And we are in a situation where we have a president in an authoritarian way commandeering troops to invade a state that's like, we do not want you here. There's an absolute agreement of every branch of government, every public official in Illinois to, we want troops out of our state. And yet they're going to come here anyway.
Yeah, I agree that other people in other places may not be paying attention. I thought the same thing. I mean, my daughter is obviously, she's in high school, so she's not paying attention to what's happening in Illinois, but she came home yesterday and it was normal after swim meet, whatever. And I'm like freaking out. I'm texting you and I'm like, are you okay? Like, what's happening? And it was just this weird juxtaposition of exactly what you said. Like, there are people who just like living their normal lives. But I think the key to understand here is, this can happen. Like, if this is allowed to proceed the way that it looks like Trump wants to proceed, then this can happen anywhere. I live in Connecticut, and that means that he could send whatever, I guess South Carolina's National Guard and have them lining up in my neighborhood. So people should care, even if it's not affecting you directly.
Well, the last time we had Professor Vladeck, Steve Vladeck, on our podcast, this is when Trump was sending troops into D.C. And what Professor Vladeck said was essentially, Trump can do this much more easily in D.C. because D.C.'s National Guard is federal in a way that other National Guards aren't. But he's doing this to normalize the use of troops elsewhere. And since that time, we've had troops in California. Now we have troops in Illinois, because we're probably second or third on his list of most hated places. He's talking about sending troops into New York. I actually think it's the mayoral election that might be why Illinois got moved up the list. But of course, Connecticut would be on the list, and a lot of other places would be on the list too that he doesn't like. And it's a way of normalizing the use of violence, the use of military force in the United States to intimidate people who disagree with him.
Yeah. And so people might be wondering, okay, well then how is what he did in California different than what he's doing now? Well, so first of all, this would be using not the Illinois National Guard, not the state's own National Guard, or bringing it under his command. This is basically collaborating with another state for a National Guard that is under the control of another state. But what Trump did in LA is we talked about Title 32. He used another statute, Title 10, Section 12406. And what that allows the president to do is to federalize the National Guard in a number of different instances when, there's an invasion or rebellion. But in this case, when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And what he claimed in LA was that because of the protests and, people, crowds or whatever it was in LA that were getting in the way or objecting and protesting to ICE's immigration raids, that he was unable to execute immigration law there using regular forces, and he needed to federalize the National Guard. Now, that statute says that the orders shall be issued through the governors of the states, and that was litigated. Judge Breyer I believe he issued an injunction, but it went up to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit basically said, even if he bypassed it, it's just a formality. In other words, the Ninth Circuit basically said that you don't need the governor's explicit consent or permission to do it.
Yeah, what they basically said was that that there's broad deference, effectively, to the president's, to Trump's determination there, and so that was good enough. Now we don't have that in Illinois. No one's.
That's right. So he doesn't have that pretext or even there aren't, as far as I'm aware, like protests happening in Chicago that he can claim that he's unable to execute immigration law there. Though I wonder because Chicago's a sanctuary city, right? Yeah. So I wonder if he might try to invoke that. But here's the thing. Here's another big difference for why it's advantageous for him to try to keep this under Governor Abbott's command. Because once he federalizes the troops, as I mentioned before, then they are subject to all of the same constraints as the regular armed forces. And one of those constraints is the Posse Comitatus Act. And the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the military from being used for domestic law enforcement. This is what Judge Breyer in LA found had been violated by the federalized National Guard troops, and maybe even the regular military, because there were Marines there as well. So, but when they're under state active duty, or when they're even in this hybrid, it's not clear. Well, I don't know if it's ambiguous, but definitely in state active duty, the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply. And when they're in this hybrid status, it's not clear that it applies either. I don't think it does. And so he may think that he can then like send them in and let them start arresting people or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I just will note that when this is where we're at, okay, as a country, is that we basically had the governor and the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois begging people not to do anything if they see an ICE agent, because Trump could use that as an excuse to send federal troops in. And basically, you know, what Trump has made a number of cryptic comments, right? When he said he's going in, but he said, I'm not saying, I didn't say when. And the theory that Governor Pritzker floated was that it was going to be centered around Mexican Independence Day. Of course, because Trump doesn't, he was not going to go after white people. He's going to go after a minority group. So when there's Mexican Independence Day, people will be whatever, celebrating, drinking beer, whatever. And if anything happens to anyone, then that will be his excuse to send armed troops into Illinois.
Yeah. And I mean, think about that, because that's sort of a win-win, right? For Trump, in the sense of, if nobody goes out and protests or objects, then Stephen Miller gets to go and round up, his goons get to go round up their 3,000 immigrant quota that they need to fill every single day. That's what they're supposedly trying to do, is deport 3,000 people a day. And that's easier for them to do without people protesting. But then if people do go out and protest, then that becomes the pretextual justification for sending in the military. Right. So either way, this is chilling free speech. I mean, because then you send in the military and then people are even, more constrained in their expression.
Look, it's often the case throughout history that the people who ultimately are being, who are complying with an authoritarian, have the power, have the strength, have the might to potentially overthrow the person or to limit that person's power. And it's the use of power to cower them and to get them to comply. And that's what this can be about. Yeah. Really, Trump is using this. He's not going to send, I think the number of troops he sent into California, when I read Judge Breyer's opinion, was maybe, I think there's like 300 still there in LA, but that's such a focus, right? And that's creating so much headlines and so forth. If he sends 300 troops into Illinois, it's about making a statement. It's about intimidation. It's about sending a signal to his base that he's fighting against the people in Chicago who are viewed as the other, whatever, the bad, non-Americans.
The elites. Yeah. What do you think of Pritzker telling people not to? Was he saying don't protest? I mean, I don't know that I agree with that. I understand that it would definitely be used as a pretext. On the other hand, and I mean, right now, I don't live in Chicago, so that's why I'm interested in what you say. Like, there is a part of me that says don't comply in advance.
Well, this is what he said, and he chose his words carefully, I'm sure. Okay. We know before anything has happened here that the Trump plan is to use any excuse to deploy armed military personnel to Chicago. If someone flings a sandwich at an ICE agent, Trump will try to go on TV and declare an emergency in Chicago. I'm imploring everyone, if and when that happens, do not take the bait. I think what he's trying to tell people is, don't do anything stupid. Don't do anything that could be construed as some sort of act against federal employees. So he's not saying don't speak, but he's saying be really careful what you do, because, the example you used was a carefully chosen one. If someone flings a sandwich, of course, I think we just were recently, you and I, talking about the person who flung a sandwich, and they tried to indict that person with a felony. And it was sort of a silly thing that grand jury saw through that. But I think his point is, no matter how silly it is, no matter how minor it is, Trump's going to use it as an excuse. So mind your P's and Q's. And does that mean you don't speak? No, but I will say this, it does chill speech, because he's basically saying, be very careful, because if you get anywhere close to any kind of line or have any sort of, demonstrative action, Trump could construe that as something more.
And I think that's a fair admonition, because it's true. It means that, people at this point need to know that when they protest, it has to be nonviolent. It has to, as you said, mind your P's and Q's, because they are using any pretext.
Right. But of course, that is exactly the point, right? Yes. The point is to chill our speech. The point is to intimidate us. And here we are. I mean, so, when you were asking, like, wow, how have we gotten to this point? It's like, here we are on a podcast discussing Trump using troops to intimidate people who he doesn't agree with. And that's where we're at.
And just to bring this back also to LA, the court, as I noted, found that the Federalized National Guard had violated Posse Comitatus. So he's enjoined the president and Hegseth from basically using the National Guard for domestic law enforcement. He hasn't said that they have to leave or anything like that. He's basically saying follow the law, because they are constrained by this. And the other thing to note is that in that case, it's interesting because the government was trying to advance some pretty new theories about either the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply when he federalizes the troops, or that engaging in crowd control and riot control isn't, domestic law enforcement, and that, when they're protecting federal property, that's not, that's not law enforcement function. So, they are trying to push the limits here, I think, so that they can have ground, more latitude if they do decide to try this in other cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do think that one thing that we are still in a world where Trump is still taking into account what the laws say. He's taking into account what courts say. He's trying to find a way to accomplish what he wants, and he's trying to push you use the term Overton window. He's trying to push the Overton window. But I don't think that we're in a spot where, he's flaunting the law completely. So we do still have time, and there's still an ability to move the needle here to try to resist this.
I agree, mostly.
So, Asha, we had all sorts of things you might have talked about this week.
Oh my gosh.
It was everything. I mean, there's so much stuff going on, right? Everything from the CDC, Epstein survivors coming forward.
Tariffs.
Yeah, for a while we thought maybe there'd be Trump personal health news, but here we are, and we're going to talk, I think, about something that you think needs to be bigger news than it has been.
Yeah, I'm kind of shocked that this has sort of gone under the radar, and it is not under the radar, but it's not being given the attention that I think it should be, given the circumstances surrounding it. And this is the strike on alleged narco traffickers from Venezuela who were, I guess, in a boat in international waters.
And when we say strike, we don't mean like balls and strikes, like, someone threw a pitch and it was inside a strike zone. We mean like a missile was launched and blew the thing up and everyone died, basically, right?
Yes.
And just making sure we're talking about the same thing here.
Correct. And it's interesting because remember when there was the strike on Iran, that was major news, and we talked about the legality of it and all this kind of stuff. But this is sort of, the president came on TV and was like, these were terrorists, and people are like, oh, okay, and we've moved on. And in some ways, to me, this is partly, I think, a conditioning from the post 9/11 war on terror, where we think that as soon as you use the magic word terrorist, that somehow any and all military force is authorized, and that is not the case. I got in a blue sky argument with Tom Nichols about this yesterday. And I love Tom Nichols. I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but I appreciate his viewpoints, but I think he was just dead wrong, which is, he said, well, people are on their own if they're terrorists and they're outside the United States, even if you're Americans. And I was like, yeah, that's actually not the case.
Let me just say, I think one thing that's important about what you just brought up is that I think a lot of people act and think as if like Trump came out of nowhere. Like we had this lovely functioning government and everything was great in the United States. Then Trump came and turned this really a fantastic government into something totally different. And I think one thing you're seeing here is the seeds of something very concerning that occurred during a prior administration, the Bush administration, where essentially there was this idea that if you label someone a terrorist, they don't have rights, that, that is a person that is a non-person. You don't have to give the same level of regard to. And really Trump has taken advantage of that. And he basically has labeled any international drug trafficking organization as a terrorist. And there was an order in which he did that. And so he's, these people in this boat, he's calling them narco terrorists, but really they're drug dealers. Okay. And I used to investigate and prosecute international drug cartels myself when I was a federal prosecutor. They're awful. They commit really horrible crimes. I've seen videos and photos in my time doing that I have things I wish I could unsee because they're so grotesque and so disturbing. But they're international criminal organizations. I would not call them terrorists in the way that we usually think of the word. And so essentially now what we were doing is investigating, interdicting, capturing, and trying to indict, charge, and bring into and bring into the United States for trial people like El Chapo, who my former office indicted. Now here's the idea is like, no, we're going to have Tomahawk cruise missiles just blow them up.
Right. And just to drive home your point, there are a plethora of criminal statutes that criminalize drug trafficking. I lived in Bogota, Colombia in the late 90s. I like to say, around season 3 of Narcos, basically. And I knew a lot of DEA agents and FBI people that were detailed to the embassy there, and they are working with, the Colombian National Police and everybody. It's treated as it's always been treated as a criminal matter. And by the way, that is a country where there was narco terrorism, and Pablo Escobar was a narco terrorist where he engaged in active terrorism against the government of Colombia and, against judges and stuff. But even so, we, the United States, did not treat it as a terrorism matter. So, the Trump administration has formally designated some groups as terrorist organizations like Tren de Aragua. That does change certain things that you can do. So, for example, when you have an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, you're prohibited from donating money to them. So, that becomes a criminal act, for example. Foreign terrorist organizations can be subject to national security, electronic surveillance, like secret electronic surveillance. So there are powers that can be activated, statutory powers. But military force is a different category. And the reason that the 9/11 terrorist targets are different than these, drug traffickers or whatever is because the 9/11 targets are covered by a congressional authorization for the use of military force. the 2001 Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which is very broadly worded. It is still in effect 24 years later. There are a lot of problems with it, but it does explicitly authorize the president to use, any and all necessary force against the people who participated in 9/11 or associated forces. And of course, that has been stretched very tenuously. I don't think anyone could reasonably argue that that could be stretched to include members of Tren de Aragua or random drug traffickers in international waters.
Yes. Well, Trump's like, hold my beer. But sure. In all seriousness, I mean, I think that, what you have here, and that's why I say there's a real through line to what happened during the Bush years. What Trump is doing is, he is attacking, we talked about a minute ago, the use of forces in the United States against a state that doesn't want them. Here, the Venezuelan government really doesn't want U.S. military forces there. In fact, the Venezuelan president called this an extravagant, unjustified, immoral, and absolutely criminal threat against Venezuela, the use of 8 warships from the United States that were there in conducting operations. And yet, essentially what Trump's saying is these are state-sponsored terrorism. These are sponsored by Venezuela. And it sure sounds a lot like what we heard during the Bush years about certain, in that case, Arab states or Islamic states that were supporting terrorist groups. And so therefore we were going to use military force there.
Yes. But again, I just want to emphasize he had a separate authorization for the use of military force in Iraq.
Yes.
He definitely got that. I mean, I'm just pointing out that, and this matters legally, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the Constitution divides war powers between Congress and the president. So when Congress provides an authorization for the use of military force, that is effectively an exercise of its declare war power. And when that happens, that means that the political branches, Congress and the president, are acting in concert, and that the president's war powers are bolstered by that congressional authorization. In other words, he has the full authority of the government. When he doesn't have congressional authorization, he is relying only on his Article 2 authority. And he does have commander-in-chief authority, but that commander-in-chief authority is not permission to go around bombing whoever you feel like.
Right. Now, there's also one irony here. Well, first of all, by the way, I should note, because I made a statement about what Trump is claiming about the Venezuelan government. I mean, there are, I think, some of the recent reports, I read a report from the Washington Post that, in fact, the intelligence reports coming out of the Trump administration don't support what Trump is saying, which is going to come as a surprise to no one, that actually the Venezuelan government doesn't support this group. But putting all that to the side here for a minute, it's interesting. One irony, of course, is that Trump came to power through an election in which he claimed that he was the peacetime president and we shouldn't have foreign wars, but he loves using the military to bomb Iran or bomb random terrorists, because I think he just likes the feeling of power and likes using power and feeling like an authoritarian who can exercise power.
Well, and I just want to make sure people understand this. Even during the Bush years and then the Obama administration, and I presume into, the Trump years, even when there were drone strikes on suspected terrorists that were covered by the AUMF, there is a very, detailed process that the Department of Defense goes through. There are these presidential policy directives that would have to be followed to show how they identify the target, how they verify that this is a person that, falls within the scope of the authorization, that capture is infeasible. This is another thing that even with members of Al-Qaeda, there would have to be a finding. And I mean, this is kind of loose, it's like, there's a lot of deference, but the point is they would have to show that a threat was imminent, that capture is infeasible, that they had to do the strike. And I am sorry, but it is not clear to me that any of those processes would have been followed in this case, because he's saying that they are terrorists. We actually have no idea who they are.
Well, right. I mean,
Like
Trump.
a random family like speeding across the ocean.
Well, Trump actually posted on his Truth Social account a grainy black and white video of this attack, and it looks like a pretty small boat. I mean, I don't know how much. He claims 11 people were on it. He calls them terrorists, but there may be 11 people on it. It's a pretty small boat. It gets just destroyed with one missile strike. He's got 8 U.S. warships in the region. You don't think that 8 U.S. warships could do something to interdict this vessel? I mean, come on, right?
Right. And so this is also, there are international law norms as well, not norms, international laws about, identifying targets and, proportionality, all of these things these frameworks that govern how we use military force that you don't both under domestic constitution, international law. This is incredibly problematic. And just to compare it to, or to follow the through line that we started in the first block about, if this is allowed to happen, this could happen anywhere. I mean, do we really want to open the door, Renato, that as soon as Trump declares you or his administration declares you a terrorist, then you are a perfectly legitimate target for a military strike wherever you are? That is very difficult to, accept, especially when there is clearly, and this is something that's coming up in the courts, and we can talk about this, even in their deportation efforts, they are not, there does not seem to be any process by which they are actually figuring out if someone is truly a terrorist or, a member of these groups.
Yeah, I mean, I hope Rosie O'Donnell doesn't take a vacation to South America anytime soon, right? She could potentially be.
This is for real. Yeah, he could do it.
No, so that's where I want to bring things to here for a minute, Asha, because there's a lot of people who listen to our podcast every week, or they watch it on the video on the Midas Touch Network, and they're wondering to themselves, I've got a lot of problems right now. Okay. Trump's going to send troops maybe to my state or your state or wherever. He's trampling on the Constitution. He's rounding up people and shipping them out. Why do I need to be concerned about him bombing people overseas, of all things? Why is that important? Why should I care about that?
Because of what I just said, because it could be you. I mean, I don't know. Like, do we know that they aren't Americans? We don't have any window into how they identify these targets and what the legal basis was. Again, there was no authorization by Congress to do this. And without that, just to bring back an old thread, under Article 2, he can't engage in these kind of offensive operations. Offensive meaning the opposite of defensive, not necessarily offensive in the moral sense, but he can engage in, there is an idea of inherent self-defense. And this is actually the theory that we have used for drone strikes on, the 9/11 related terrorism drone strikes. But that is a preemptive self-defense theory. So I don't even understand. There's clearly no self-defense here. And if what you're saying is he doesn't need that, he can just, if it's a terrorist and he thinks they're a threat to the United States, then he has the authority under the Constitution to destroy them, then good luck to all of us, because that means that there's literally no guardrails.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reason why we don't just go around bombing people is because the American system is not to be judge, jury, and executioner, right?
Correct.
You have process and ultimately have a punishment that's proportionate to the offense. And here, I mean, when I'm looking now at the designation of international cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, it's not just Tren de Aragua or MS-13. It's the Sinaloa drug cartel and other drug cartels that I used to investigate back in the day. These are just essentially Mexican drug cartels. And really, instead of developing evidence and doing your buy bust or your wiretap and getting, seizing some cocaine and then having due process where someone's got an attorney and they come in for they ultimately are arrested, and they've got they can file motions and can confront witnesses and so forth. Now they just get destroyed out of the sky with a missile. And that's really, I think that, you can't think of a more stark difference between those two methods of dealing with the same problem.
Yeah, and people need to pay attention, and this should be a bigger story, because maybe more than many of the other things, this does have some pretty dark consequences or implications.
Yeah. I mean, between sending troops today, we've talked about sending troops from one state into another to invade a state against their will. And now we talk about blowing people out of the sky without any sort of process whatsoever. Definitely. You don't need to convince me that there's a lot to pay attention to today. So, Asha, before we go, I should say, before we get started talking about anything else, I am excited about our cruise. We're starting to get people signing up.
I know.
That is awesome.
It is. We had a great happy hour last month. We're going to have another one later this month. And we're kind of putting together the programming for the cruise, and I'm super excited.
Yeah, so am I. So check out the link below. I hear that you're also excited about pumpkin spice latte, something my wife is also very excited about. I never done it for me.
No, I'm not excited. I just suggested that at the time because it's very controversial, and I thought we could have a heated debate about it.
Okay, my wife thinks it's the bee's knees. I don't understand what's so great about it. Yeah, she's super into that. I don't understand why.
It's not just pumpkin spice. So I think it's a broader topic too, because I think Starbucks, I'm not a big Starbucks person.
Neither am I. Okay, neither am I.
No offense, but I feel like their coffee tastes kind of burnt-ish. But they have like a whole day that they do their PSL day or whatever. So that's when they launch it, and that's like, I guess, supposedly the official start of fall. But then, of course, the bigger question is, does everything have to? I get pumpkin spice latte, like I get why you might flavor a latte that, but then when you start looking around, there's pumpkin spice everything, and that's where it gets controversial.
So first of all, I don't put a lot of crap inside my coffee. Okay, I drink black coffee, and I feel like one thing, I used to go to Starbucks a lot when I was younger. And I learned later that I was basically ingesting like Big Macs, essentially. It was just the sheer number of calories was insane. I do think that's part of it, right? It's like finding a way to turn coffee into a dessert and drinking desserts with each meal. That's a big part of the problem. But I guess for me, when I drink coffee, I like going to like an artisan, like a nice neighborhood coffee shop where there's like, they're actually brewing their own coffee and that sort of thing. Is that too snobby for you?
No, does Starbucks not brew their own coffee?
I mean, they do, but it's like in the same way that McDonald's does. But I'm talking about like going to a place that doesn't have like 5,000 locations.
Yeah.
And has like, and they're brewing it fresh, and, it tastes better.
Yeah.
More distinctive.
I just drink coffee at home. I don't even go get it from anywhere.
I drink coffee at home too. But if I'm going to go out, I think they can actually be really nice to go to a coffee shop. And, in the same way that people used to go to bookstores, I used to go to bookstores all the time, because it's nice to just be out and have a nice, something nice. You can have something that it tastes a little different than the stuff you have at home.
Yeah. Okay, I don't disagree. I wanted you to argue with me about pumpkin spice.
I can't get too worked up about pumpkin spice latte.
There's nothing that offends you, like no, like when cereal is flavored pumpkin spice, or when pumpkin spice peanut butter or something. I mean, you don't know about this whole everything.
I don't know.
Comes up every fall.
Okay, this is like when I ask you and you don't know like any sports teams or whatever. I guess I'm just like not into the pumpkin spice craze. Like,
I'm not into it either. I'm just thinking that this is a good, It usually generates a lot of heated debate, but
wow. Okay, I'm against, and I think so are you. So
yeah, I'm whatever. I'm sort of against. It depends on what it is.
oh wow. Okay, I was going to say for a minute, pumpkin spice lattes brought us together, but apparently not.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.